All right, so for my final project today, I'm going to be talking about research in developing countries taking benefits seriously. And this is by Leonard H. Glantz, and it starts on page 278. So the gist of what I'm going to be talking about basically is how benefit and ethicality are going to be directly correlated. And that morality in different developed countries varies when research is done in developing countries, and now there's a new ethicality standmark on it, and how Glantz disagrees or opposes or refutes some views on why research in developing countries should stay where it is. So to begin the article, Glantz brings up the issue of the SIBA population. And if you don't know what that kind of is about, Munger developed a way to increase folate and vitamin B, which decreases cleft lip or palate. And so he chose to do that in the SIBA population. And by doing that, he would only take like 10 drops of blood and put it into a petri dish and then examine how the genetic coding goes. So he brings up three questions on ethical research in these developing countries, and if these are not followed, how does ethicality then become regulated? So the first one is mainly about the goal of the research, and it's important to the population is represented by the research subject. So if there needs to be an emphasized importance in all research opportunities to directly benefit the developing country, the research subject, and the population most affected by it. If this correlation is not if the benefit and the ethicality of this research isn't going hand in hand, the ethicality of this research has now diminished. So the benefit and ethicality have to go together, and if not, it's going to be mismatched from the beginning, and then therefore the research is declared unethical. And then there's the quality of informed consent. Well, in the majority of these developed countries, it is going to be difficult in accurately describing the procedure to those who aren't as highly educated as those in the developed countries. So informed consent only goes a limited amount of the way. So that puts autonomy at question. And it includes whether or not the individual is informed about the research that is being performed on them, but also what they benefit from doing the research. And then the third question is mainly about whether or not the country or population benefits from the research that is being conducted. So some countries don't have the same job or insurance discrimination that we have in the US. So with that, everything going on, the research doesn't inherently harm them by choosing to participate in it, because there is no economic discrimination since they all live in poverty. So that benefits them in a sense to participate, but it also doesn't give them any other benefit other than that if it is not already disclosed. All right. And so Glantz's main points, he argues that researchers from developed countries cannot perform research on those in developing countries unless there's a direct benefit to those who are used as research. And then also, if the research developers and funders make the benefits of the actual treatment unavailable to those tested and the country in which it is targeted, then exploitation occurs. So exploitation, Glantz argues the entire way through his essay, is mainly about not providing the people you're researching on the benefit of the doubt to get access to what they're, helping you prove or invent. If at that point you decide, oh, well, we're going to patent it at a certain price, then you guys won't be able to purchase it in mass quantity, which therefore wouldn't benefit you. But thanks for giving me the information I need to provide this treatment to other affluential countries, that then therefore exploits not only the individuals who were researched upon, but also the country in which allowed them to come in and research. So that goes, it's a double entendre for that. So their research goes hand in hand. If it exploits one section, it most likely will exploit the massive population. However, there is times where if there is no real exploitation, or if the benefit cannot necessarily influence the entire population, but only one person, then some will argue, well, it benefits the individual, but it doesn't the population, but it still benefits somebody. Well, we'll get into that in the next slide, but that's an ethical issue in and of itself. And the last main point that he brings is basically the conclusion of it all is, if all efforts are given to the developing countries, then researchers and funders and developers must develop realistic plans to make their inventions available to the relevant population in which is most heavily affected by this intervention. This in turn ensues ethical practices. For instance, if we compare this to the AIDS epidemic in the 90s in the US, we ourselves were became infected with AIDS. However, that didn't mean that Africa wasn't already dealing with AIDS. So when we decide to patent and kind of get through and how we decide to target AIDS, then exclude Africa, even though we tested on different African countries to get, AIDS transmission rates down, which in this article is called AZT. That's AZT regimen, and that's what helps lower the transmission rates between mother and child of AIDS. And we go test in Africa, come back and do it in the US, and these children are now getting all of this, fineness, and they're getting all of the medication, but we don't provide it to the country in which we are doing it. It is what? Exploitation. So that's what he is mainly talking about, is he wants the research to benefit not only the parties in which have created the whole thing, but the parties in which that you are going to study upon. And so that leads us to the objections of these three main points. Is if the standard, and the standard right now is made by, I believe, CIOMS, which is like the guidelines. So it's like this new ethical research in developing countries committee. Goodness gracious. It's the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences. And so they worked with the WHO in establishing ethical practices for research in developing countries. Well, with their creation in 1992, it didn't accurately get all of the pieces of information to maintain it and make it super strict. So it's ethical for you to go into the country and do all of that, but if it affects the individual and the subject, that's okay. But if you leave, then it becomes a question of what are we going to do next. So it worked in a sense, but it didn't target all of the factors of ethical research in developing countries. So people saw the CIOMS and they were like, well, the standard is too strict and it would reduce the amount of research that could be conducted in certain countries. And that's the thing. If it benefits the country we are testing, it is ethically okay to continue research. But then people argue, well, what if it benefits the individual, but not the whole population? So for instance, we'll bring it back to the AIDS epidemic, and they bring out the AZT. Well, the AZT costs $800 for a massive case of it. Well, it only takes $50 worth of medication to then stop the transmission of AIDS to the child. So that's okay. We did it. Awesome. So it costs less. Good. But if we don't provide that to the entire population, it doesn't diminish the rates of transmission, it just diminishes the individuals in which we're tested upon. And even though that's a significant number, they were trials, right? So we had to go like, for instance, Dolly the sheep, they had to go through 226 different trials to get Dolly on the 227th time. So we are now researching on these individuals, so it may not be entirely affected in and of itself, but then it's also not going to benefit the entire population. So the transmission rates will continue to rise if people don't take proper precautions in future, right? So it's not really doing anything to benefit, even if it's only benefiting one individual. And I also thought that even though it benefits one individual, but not the whole population, I was thinking like, that's like in similarity, not the best analogy, right? But in comparison, right? Let's say I get a new job. Awesome. I'm so excited. I'm having a great time. I'm super happy with what they're telling me about the company. The company is giving massive, um, you know, like it's giving me hype about what I'm gonna go to do. But when I get there, we're talking, I'm having a good time. I love the managers, I love the people. And then I'm asking about what are my benefits from working here. Even though I love the company, I love what they're trying to do, similar to what these researchers are going to do for the affected population, even though they love what they're trying to accomplish, what are they benefiting from? So I'm now asking my employer, what am I benefiting from, choosing you to do my research? And they're like, choosing you to be my employer. And they're saying, oh, well, you know what you get a 50% off discount to all of our sister brands and our store. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's awesome. And then I ask, okay, what's my pay rate? And they go, oh, you don't have one. What? So awesome benefit that I got the 50% off discount, but now I have nothing to follow it up with. So even though I have the 50%, what money am I going to use with that 50%? Also, what money am I losing? I'm losing money technically, right? Because I'm spending all of this time, all of this effort in something that I'm really not gaining anything. Even though I gained the 50% discount, I didn't gain any pay rate. So then it's all of this work, all of this effort is going unnoticed in a sense because I'm not getting accurately compensated for it. Same thing in the case of SIBA or AIDS pandemic, where they research on these individuals, say, here's your benefit, you're cured, but now your sister next door is not. So oops, that may not be great, but this is it. So the affected population, when I don't get paid, is my bills, my parents, my family, my rent, my car, right? All of these different things, that's also being affected in this other country. So if they were to not, even if it were to benefit one person, it doesn't make any sense if it doesn't benefit the entire affected population. And the second objection is, you can't always trust the government or funders' promises, which is true. I mean, it's word of mouth or sometimes by contract, but what binds you to that contract? What makes us say to them, okay, you got to do what you got to do? What are we going to do to prevent it? What is there to do to prevent it? There's nothing, right? These funders, with the lack of, economic and regulations in these countries that they're going to, these developers and funders can now navigate the loopholes and say, oh, I'm going to do this. This is what is going to benefit you. But I don't have to stick to my word. And so that's what's hard, is how do you keep these two individuals, the government and the funder, on their promise? And we don't have an answer for that. That's where I think Lance didn't necessarily give me or the reader a massive view on how to necessarily attack it, because he states the potential unethical behavior in the future by the funder is no excuse for not having a realistic plan at the offset. Okay. This should only occur once per funder. After re-engaging once, they cannot be relied upon again to justify research in the future. So we're giving them a one-off situation, but even then, that one-off situation can affect millions or thousands of people. So that's the problem with this, is that is an objection, and I don't think Lance given that proper view on how we could attack it. And that's where his argument has a flaw to ethical research, because there is nothing in developing countries, some countries, to bind the government and the funder to provide the benefits for the research. That's the biggest problem. And it will restrict access to new interventions. That's a big objection. So once the invention is produced, the price will automatically drop and will be readily available to those in developing countries. So, there's really no point in continuing research if developers decide that the current price limits if the current price limits the availability to the subject. So this is what's Glantz, the objection in Glantz arguing that what's the point of deciding, oh, I'm going to research on everyone, right? With the AZT, for instance, it's $800 per case, but now it's $50 worth $50 worth of that 800 case can be used to decrease the transmission rates in the mothers with AIDS, right? So if they decide, oh, well, I don't know how much it's going to cost, I don't know if this is going to do anything, all this stuff, the manufacturer has complete control of the interventions. So if the manufacturer is not able to say, this is my price point right now, once I gain further research or insight into what I'm doing, I will be able to adjust the price point. So if he says coming in, okay, the AZT is worth $800 per case. Well, that per case is only used for one person. That's not accurate because we figured out that it's $50. So if he doesn't adjust it, now the availability to that country or their population goes down. So the research is therefore classified as what? Unethical. That's a problem. All right. And so the last one is there are diseases that primarily affect certain population and there are no treatments readily available to them. So the treatment could be expensive at that point. Okay, good point. I like that answer. How that, objection, that's fair objection. However, why do we research in the first place? Like, why are problems typically resolved? Like, we knew that cancer was a thing, but why did we choose to discover or invent newer ways to, decrease cancer or cancer cells in our body? Why? Even though our country doesn't have super high rates of cancer, that doesn't mean that we can't keep exploring things. Same thing with research in general. I think, and I believe, that research should be widely available to affected areas, even if your current population is not heavily affected by it. So just because we are not, this is an example, just because we are not heavily affected by the cold and Africa is, doesn't mean that me, an American scientist, can't research and study newer ways to research the cold and to find newer solutions and inventions for decreasing the symptoms, the longevity of it, everything. But then me saying to myself, oh, okay, I know now, even though it's not for my country, okay, I'm just going to keep it and patent it and never use it. Well, that's not ethically fair for the country that's most effective, because typically researchers are going to want to find a price that's lower than what they're looking at. And so with that being said, it becomes a problem for these people to, I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. If you're studying in Europe, for instance, where the cold is prevalent, okay, and then you come back and that's the most heavily affected area, but you're coming back to the US and saying, I'm patenting it, I'm doing all this other stuff, well, now Europe doesn't benefit, right? So that becomes a problem. And it's not morally correct or right to prohibit the growth of science and research if it's not available for the most affected. So if some African countries are most affected by the cold still, why are we not being able to provide that to them, and why can't we? That stems a lot on our capitalistic environment, and that also kind of ties to Nelson's arguments about the right to healthcare, because why, if we have a right to healthcare, right? If we do, why can't they? So if we have the right, why can't they have a right? Same thing with Canada, right? This is the best part about it is I'm allergic to peanuts and tree nuts. So when I need help or I need epinephrine, it is $600 here for an EpiPen or for an Auvi-Q, none of which are covered by insurance. I sometimes get coupons from my allergist, but we have to pay out of pocket for that. But that's a life-saving thing for me. If I go to Canada, my friend, Lauren is telling me about her allergy and she pays for $60 worth of a epinephrine tube and a needle. Why am I paying so much more for that? It's capitalistic ideals, right? So this whole idea of non-socialist Medicare is now influencing other countries from getting the appropriate health healthcare they need to survive or to help their country survive in the long term. And so that's kind of what Nelson is arguing, is that even though America is making money off of this, there are better ways to help the world other than just making money for ourselves. And that comes down on simply how our country was founded. And I wish there was an easier one, but it's not. But again, going back to point two and tying this into the last one, you can't always trust the government or the funder, right? So if we're seeing all of this and we have all of the inventions and the medicine and everything, and we're not sending it to these countries that we're testing on, ethicality diminishes, and so does the benefit because there was none given to them, but also the autonomy, because now these people, right? So Childs and Siegler, right, talks about autonomy and how patient professional relationships are kind of transgress. If the patient isn't being, in all of the different professional patient relationships, if the patient's autonomy is not inherently or accurately thought of or the first choice in all medical solutions, there should be no medical solution. The autonomy of the patient comes first. So if the autonomy is compromised by lack of benefit or unethicality or ethicality, right? There's a problem. Okay, so ethicality is an issue, and also the right to healthcare. So we need to start thinking about how developed countries go into developing countries to harness inventions, medical health care, everything, and how that influences our country, but also the others. It's the same thing right now in with the flu. They're designing a shot to get rid of the flu, right? Like they're doing with COVID. They want to basically give mass immunity to it. But to do that, they had to go to a developed country, I'm going to say somewhere in, Latin America, to test on pigs and kind of understand swine flu. Um, but it's cheaper to test on pigs there than it is here, and there's less regulations there than there is here. So that's what they're doing in research countries. The minute we start testing on human subjects, it's the same thing as cloning. There's a problem with like human trials. If it goes wrong, you are now liable for the life that you're choosing to test on, and that life has to give full autonomy and no in full informed consent to be able to give you full mass autonomy. And then on top of that, the right to their healthcare thereafter needs to be top priority because you were the one who wanted to research upon it, even though they chose to do it, to participate in it. So that was the end of my presentation. I apologize that it was super long. I really like this piece, and I hope it gave some clarity and support and all of that. But it was a pleasure having you as my professor this quarter, and I really loved this course, even though philosophy is not my strong suit. But the Fire Breathing Sloth Friend is out, and I hope you have a fantastic spring quarter, and I hope you and your family are all happy and healthy.